we take rights for granted. You don't hear much said about rights, if anything, before the Enlightenment. Then the Enlightenment taught, all right, what did they believe before the Enlightenment? They believed that we had responsibilities. Not rights, but responsibilities. The Enlightenment said you have rights. And this rights business eventually was to lead to entitlements. And entitlements was eventually to lead to, I mean, I heard a talk show person say yesterday on the way down to downtown Atlanta. We used to feel like we should help this poor man we see lying on a park bench, but today we say, let the government take care of him, and we've abdicated our responsibility. That's one thing that came out of the concept of rights, but something else, folk. If this country is ever taken over by an uncivilized country, all of our concepts of rights will go right out the window. Just like it's happened in Roman times, where they allowed uncivilized people in, and the uncivilized people eventually just moved in and took over and more or less shoved the Romans aside. I prefer to think, now this is me, that humans have responsibilities, not rights. I don't have a right to see my children behave themselves. I have a responsibility to try to guide them to where they will, but it's not a right. And I don't even have a right to good health. My health can break any second, and especially when you get to be my age. A lot of men who are healthy at 70 are very sick at 71. Do I have a right to be well? I have a responsibility now to try to eat right, exercise right, and stay healthy, but I don't have a right to it, to good health. I prefer, again, the idea of responsibilities over right, but the concept of rights came from the Enlightenment. It's built into our Constitution, and most of you are conditioned to think it's great. I've got to tell this story. I told it once last semester. There was a certain woman, gave herself to a lot of drinking, kept herself dirty. Her brother finally kicked her out of the house. So she was living with her brother. He kicked her out of the house. She was on the street, and one day she heard the weather report that it was going to be a cold night. She was alone in the cold and hungry. She thought, I don't know what, I've broken a few laws, I'll call the police. She had a dime. She got to a payphone, called the cops and told the cops, we don't care where you are. We don't want you. You can stay right where you are. And she spent the night shivering in the cold and freezing. You might say, weren't her rights violated? No. It was the best thing that could have been done for her. The next day, she got herself cleaned up, stopped her drinking, got herself a job, did so well on a job, she even got a promotion on a job and got more money. Her brother let her come back into his home. Then eventually she was able to get on and move out. What am I saying? Sometimes kicking a person out in the street is the best thing you can do for them. Now, if that sounds cold and if that sounds hard, life itself is cold and hard. I mean, it's cold and it's hard. But sometimes it's the best thing you do for them. No, to me, this lady had no right to a free meal, no right to a warm bed. She had the responsibility to make herself desirable to where somebody, employers are looking for good workers. And if you're willing to take a job, you can find a job. If you, I mean, of course, you didn't call, yes.
I wanted to comment regarding the thought that you just shared.
Yeah.
It is a hard pill to swallow sometimes.
Yes, it's
And
hard.
we know that statement, it's a little tricky.
It's
Only
tricky.
because it depends on the situation, the
Well,
circumstance, whoever.
If she
And
had
there's a-
taken sick, yeah.
Well, no, I get that. And the reason I say that is because there's something called experiential wisdom that one gains over time.
Yeah, that's.
Sometimes the longer you've lived on the earth, sometimes you learn different things, you be exposed to different things in your thought process, and you just learn
You
different
change.
things. So you start to change. So, in other words, I can understand that thought process or what that's, you know,
Yeah.
because there are times when people can even be in situations where you have family members,
Yeah.
where we think we're helping someone, and there's so many shows that you see now, we think we're helping somebody by, oh yeah, come on, da 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 da, and actually what happens is we enable people to continue in certain behaviors, and it's not until sometimes, they call it tough love, when you have to
Love
make
must
certain
be tough.
decisions,
Mhm.
and that ends up being the best for them. It may end up being a situation where it's not comfortable
That'd be
for them
painful.
in that moment, but them not being comfortable, this is
Yeah.
just a made-up scenario, them not being comfortable, whoever they are, it forces that person to make some decisions that ends up working better for their betterment
Yeah.
in the end, as opposed to when we think we're helping, but actually, it's not
Well,
always the best
something
thing.
I heard, and I believe this, I would go I once helped a beggar, but I didn't give him money. We were standing near an Arby's, and I said, come here, I take my family here, and I eat here myself. So he and I went into Arby's. He chose what he wanted. I paid for the meal, but he did not get one thin dime from me. I mean, he got a meal from me, but not, now why would I not give him any money? And you know, you can guess why. I figured he'd probably spend it on something he shouldn't have spent it on. Okay, you have.
I was just gonna comment about how, you know, it kind of goes back to the
Sorry.
statement of, hey, you know, you give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man how to fish.
Teach him how, yeah, that too, teach him how to fish. You put him up for life. Anyway, yes,
I was gonna say, that situation that you said, like,
yeah.
that can apply different for different people.
It-
So like, I mean, like, if you're like with a drug addict or something, and you kick them out, they're probably just gonna go look for drugs or something. Like,
That might
that's
be
why
the
you see
case.
so many homeless people out, you know?
That
Like,
might
they
be the
never
case.
learn, like.
But even the drug addict might decide now to, hey, I've got to straighten up. Now, I have two classmates who became drug addicts and both deceased right now. Both of them women, could not quit. And eventually one of them took her own life. She was our class president. At our last reunion, I said to one of my classmates that she was dealt a better hand than most of us were dealt. And I mean, you know about cards, you know what I mean. She was dealt a good hand, but she didn't play it. She was pretty, she was popular, she got out in the world. Her popular things that made her popular in high school did not really help her. She got involved in drugs and shot herself one day. The other was a cheerleader, one of the high school cheerleaders. She overdosed. Sometimes, I mean, you know, it's hard to know what to do. In some cases, should you help them or should you just say, hey,
They gotta figure it out themselves.
they do, yes, that's how it was, yeah, they have to see it. All right, we'll move on. Now, the Enlightenment featured science becoming popular. In other words, ordinary people began to take an interest in science. You had your layman, you had your actual science, your layman. Carl Sagan was a scientist in recent times who tried to make science popular. Today, Mr. Nye, Bill Nye, tries to do the same thing, and he teaches science to young children. But where that science was made easy for ordinary people to understand, Kepler's book was hard to read. In a lot of scientific journals, they use pseudo-intellectual language to make them a simple concept difficult. Skepticism of religion, people began to question religion, and one thing that hurt religion was all the wars on religion. Also, Newton's law of gravity made it seem like that there wasn't that the universe could run itself by its own laws, and therefore no God was necessary. Now, I say this reverently. I mean, this was their idea, not necessarily mine. But to compare it to a mechanical clock, you get the pendulum started on a mechanical clock. It will run until the cones run out. Some of you might know what I'm talking about, but you get those old-timey clocks had two cones and a pendulum, and then when the cones got all the way to the floor, you had to raise it. But even the mechanical clock had to be, number one, the pendulum had to be started, Well, actually, three things. Number one, the clock had to be put together by a guiding hand. Number two, the pendulum had to be started. Number three, the combs had to be raised. Now, if anyone would have said, oh, a bunch of trees fell over one day and it just happened to form this clock, they'd put him in a mental institution. He's nuts. But the clock did not put itself together, and it did not start itself, and it could not keep itself going either without some guiding hand. But they believed the universe did not need a guiding hand, did not need a start. The universe could start itself and run by itself. Again, for each of you can make up your own mind what you believe about this. As people traveled, they began to write more and more about their travels. And then they began to know, hey, over in India, they marry their girls as young as 9. I wonder if that's not a good idea. Well, it's not a good idea, but people began to question their own beliefs and philosophies owing to what they read about people traveling. And then came government, politics, which we'll talk about later. The ideas of men like John Locke. They believed that the scientific method would apply to politics. This has not proven to be true, but just like I guarantee all of you won't get the same right answers on Thursday's test, even if you've been to all the classes or listened to lectures, you won't because you're different. In the case of government, we have never found a good formula for government that keeps everybody happy. Our politicians look for it. But somebody will always feel left out, or somebody's going to criticize you, or somebody's going to say you're not doing this, or you are doing that. Which brings us up to the political men. Well, Locke. Locke believed, Thomas Jefferson was a fan of John Locke. Locke believed that God had created the universe, but then he left it to run itself, and he did not interact with it much. He believed that government, and this is something Thomas Jefferson and Socrates would have said, Confucius, that government was set up to promote some kind of order, so we could live with some kind of order. But if the government failed in its job, it could be overthrown and replaced. The Chinese did this many a time. Here is a problem with it, though, now, folks. I mean, to evaluate it critically. The South, in 1861, said the government of the United States does not meet our needs because it does not allow us to own slaves. Therefore, we're going to abolish that government and set up our own. Well, were they right? I don't think so. But they believed that by abolishing slavery, that was restricted to their freedom, that therefore they had the freedom, the right to own slaves, and nobody could tell them not to, and any government that tried to, they were going to get rid of it. So they got rid of it for 4 years anyway. But Locke believed that, and again, who's to say if the government is doing right or not? I mean, you know, a lot of times the rebels are on the wrong side of the issue. Most revolutions have not worked. Now, Locke favored revolution. So did Thomas Jefferson. He believed that when a government doesn't do what it's supposed to do, you can revolt against it. I want to tell you the sad truth about revolutions. Just south of us, in Cuba, they didn't like Batista. They got rid of Batista and got Castro. Wasn't it wonderful? In 1917, the Russian people did not like the czars. They got rid of the czars. They got Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev. Wasn't it wonderful? Yes. In China, they didn't like Chiang Kai-shek, so they got rid of Chiang and got Mao Zedong. Do you get what I'm saying? You replace what you think is bad with something that turns out to be worse, and this is true of most revolutions throughout history. Now, I know of 2 young men who decided they did not like living at home, didn't want to keep their father's rules. I said, I'm going to go somewhere where I won't have to obey my dad. I'm going to go somewhere where I'll be free from rules. I know what I'll do. I'm going to go join the Marines. those Marine corporals made their daddy seem like an easygoing, mild-mannered, soft-spoken man. Oh yes, they found out, hey, they didn't know what rules were until they joined the Marine. Did the Marines tell them to shine their shoes? Some of you might know the answer to that. Did the Marines tell them to clean the sink? Did the Marines tell them to keep their uniform neat? Yes, it did. Much more so than their daddy ever had. All right.
Oh, Professor,
Yeah.
something my parents used to say when I was growing up years ago, as a child. They used to say, I don't care where you go. There's always going to be rules. There's always going to be someone
That is
telling
true.
you what to do. It don't matter
That is
who you are. You be the president of the United States. It don't matter who you are.
Even the generals, I mean, the higher up you get in the Army, the more orders you have to take.
But we talk. No, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But no, but no, what they're saying is that, in other words, sometimes you think, oh, well, once I reach a certain, nobody can tell me anything. It doesn't matter.
Well.
And it's like somebody is going to always say so. So in other words, sometimes we don't want to be under authority. It's like we live in a world now. People don't expect it. People don't expect authority.
Because the Pittsburgh Steelers reporter Roethlisberger said, I thought that if I won 2 Super Bowls, I could do anything I want. So he was involved with a woman in the wrong way one time, and the league suspended him 4 games. And he had to sit and watch for 4 games while his team did pretty well without him. But Tiger Woods, I mean, you know, most of it, he said the same thing. That I thought that if I won a bunch of championships, I could do anything I want, and then he wound up regretting it. Wishing he hadn't done some of the things that he has done. But you get the feeling, if I can get to a certain point, I can, well, you can. And like I say, in the Army, the higher up you get, the more orders you have to obey. And even if you get 4 stars on your collar, you still take orders. You take orders from somebody, and even the President of the United States, he takes orders. There's always somebody who will be your boss. The idea, well, it's like my 8th grade teacher said, if you're looking for a horizon where you can do anything you want to, you're looking for a horizon that doesn't exist. All right, we'll move on. John Locke was not for the common man, not like Thomas Jefferson, who was to come later. But Locke greatly influenced Jefferson, and he influenced the French Revolution that came later. Montesquieu. He believed that the scientific method could be applied to politics. I've already answered that. Nevertheless, what he did believe that we have employed in our Constitution, he believed in checks and balances. In other words, you'd have at least 2, maybe 3 branches of government, and each one of them would stop the other if the other one got out of line. So when our Congress seems to get out of line, suppose the courts will step in. When our president gets out of line, the court steps in. When a court gets out of line, nobody steps in. Our courts are unpredictable and unaccountable. That was not the way it was originally set up, but that's... All right, the most famous of the Enlightenment... The Enlightenment philosophers, you'll see a word, and my wife once tried to tell me that it was wrong, but it isn't. The word is philosophies. Now, it looks like I should put an R here. No, I shouldn't. This is spelled correctly. This is a French word, and it's only used in connection with the philosophies of the Enlightenment. So when you see this word, the person who wrote it is you talking about, these men we're talking about, Locke, Montesquieu, these people of the Enlightenment. And they did a lot to change the course of world history, particularly Western civilization. Now, the most famous one of all of them was a philosophy named Voltaire. Voltaire was not an atheist, contrary to what you might have heard. He believed in God, but he was not a Christian, and he did not believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. these men pretended to be what we call deists, that God had made the earth, God had made the universe, but then he left it to run itself, and the universe could run itself. And he did not interact in the universe very much. God had made it, but it ran itself. These were the deists. Anyway, Voltaire, he believed strongly in religious toleration. For this, he's to be commended. He denounced superstition, he denounced fanaticism, as well as intolerance. He was hard against slavery. He said if people would just think, they wouldn't do these things to each other. He talked a lot about man's inhumanity of man. He said if people would think, just think. And again, Socrates might have believed in him. Socrates believed in the power of thinking. But again, folks, it has its limitations. Equally wise people can believe in opposite things. Yeah, Jordan.
I was gonna say, I don't know how, like you said, people can do whatever they want.
You can believe that if you want, but everybody's accountable.
I mean, like, yeah, you know how you said there's always a boss, like, there's always someone higher.
There's always someone above you. Yes. And also, there's some things that if you do, you'll pay the penalty for them. It's like I said, Tiger Woods. He has not quite been the same since he got caught.
I mean, he just won the Masters.
He just won the Masters, but then he lost about 3 or 4 in a row. But he's not. But even when he won the Masters, unlike the other turn, he actually had to come from behind and come on strong at the end to win that one. So on all of his other turns, he was always ahead when he won. But this one, it's not quite. It's like he's not quite what he once was. And Roethlisberger, I mean, he found out the hard way. He had to miss 4 games because of something he did that he thought that he could get away with because, hey, I'm Roethlisberger. And a former Pittsburgh quarterback, Bradshaw, said he's got to learn who he is. And that you get to that point, you actually have to live more straight. Well, there was a famous Braves ball player some 25 years ago named Otis Nixon who got caught using drugs. He said, I never said I wanted to be a role model. I don't. But hey, he wanted to play Major League ball. He wanted to earn millions of dollars, and the young men, young boys would admire him. He's going to be a role model whether he wants to be or not. He was suspended for some 80 games. He got over his drug issue and came back and played a few more years. But you take the consequence. I mean, okay, it's like I heard somebody say, when you make decisions, but you don't make consequences.
Right.
You take them. And you have no choice in the matter when it comes. Consequences you take. Choices you make, if you make the wrong ones, you take the consequences. And a lot of people do not believe the consequences will be what they are, or they wouldn't have done the deed. All right, again, Voltaire, if people would think, they would not enslave each other. If people would think, they would not fight wars. If people would think, he believed that thinking would solve our problems. The next philosopher, Diderot. Oh yeah, Voltaire. Some of these men's names are not pronounced the way they're spelled. Diderot, he said that Christianity was the worst religion in the world, but he said that the universe was nothing more than molecules. Now, Karl Marx was there to say the same thing. He said that all of humanity could be described completely in terms of chemistry and physics. I don't know how you explain thinking. I don't know how you explain emotions. But nevertheless, he believed it all was chemistry and physics. How do you explain consciousness? He tried to collect all the knowledge of mankind into one a big volume of works called his Encyclopedia. He was not the first person to write an encyclopedia, but he claimed that he was going to collect all the knowledge of mankind, put it in these books called the Encyclopedia. It did make the French people believe they could create a better society. It led to the French Revolution, and the Revolution did not make for a better society. The French chopped off King Louis XVI's head and they got Napoleon in his place. And Napoleon got millions of them killed before he was finally overthrown. The Enlightenment got farther and farther away from the original thought, and it became more radical. In other words, as your book then goes on to a section called the Later Enlightenment, and talks about Rousseau. Now Rousseau, a lot of what's in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson came from Rousseau. Rousseau tried to reconcile the ideas of individual liberty with government authority, and I think, if I can say with confidence, the more you try to abide by life's rules, the more freedom you're going to have and the more liberty you're going to enjoy by abiding by life's rules. You can have freedom provided you don't want to do things that you really shouldn't do. In other words, well, it's like I heard someone say one time, and I agree with it. I smoke all the tobacco that I choose to. I drink all the alcohol that I want to. I look at all the pornographic literature that I want to. Then he said, but I don't do any of these things because I don't want to do any of them. I've seen these things take over a person's life and grab a hold and not let go. So I don't want to be bound up like that. So he said, I don't do these things. Again, yes?
Okay, I wanted to write that down. You tried to reconcile the ideas of individual liberty to what?
Live with government with liberty, which seems like, it seems like government is there to restrict you. But he tried to reconcile the idea of government, which some people look on, laws and rules are only to restrict you. No, they're to keep you from things that you really should not do. Or they're not really restrictive, but they can keep you from things that you're better off if you don't do.
Like, in other words, you can have a fence, but it's not necessarily always to lock you in, it's to keep element out.
Well, also...
So it depends on how you look at it, right? It depends on how you view it. Some people think, like you said, some people think freedom means I can just do whatever I want to do. Yeah, but there's a responsibility with that. It comes with that because sometimes restraint
is the best course of action. Well,
is the best course of action, right?
And what you said about fence, somebody said the best fences, in other words, like you live outside the fence, you do anything you want to do except these areas that you know you should not go into. But anything else you want to do, you're free to do. Right. But don't go to a supermarket and steal something and try to get out with it. I mean, that's wrong. But anything else, except for the stuff that's actually forbidden, but anything else, you're free. But you're fenced out in certain areas. But yes.
But there is something in my opinion, in human nature that as soon as we say, you can say, as soon as you say I can't have, it's something in the human nature that says, as soon as you put a boundary up and you say we can't have, then that is a thing
falls short.
That I want. Because you say I cannot have
falls short. Oh yes.
Right.
Now, back to Rousseau. He believed in the general will, and this might sound like an oxymoron, but he believed that if everybody followed the general will, he'd be free. In other words, whatever mankind would get together and decide on what he can and cannot do, and if everybody will follow those rules, he'll be free. Now, supposing somebody decides, I'm going to do something that the general will does not allow me to do, he said that person be forced back into the general will, or in other words, and this is the oxymoron, he would be forced to be free. No, you cannot be forced to be free. Either you choose to be free or you don't choose. But anyway, that's me. Now, he believed, though, you would be forced to be free. In other words, forced back into line, forced back into conformity. Now, again, he believed in strong conformity. Now, the opposite of that was a man who came during the Romantic period called Henry David Thoreau, who said that he who would be a man must be a nonconformist. Thoreau believed that nonconformity is the way to better enlightenment, a better living, my personal leaning is more towards the road. And I mean, I'm not one to follow the general crowd, or maybe you've guessed that already. You have to be free to do your own thinking, folk, and not go along with a pack. I mean, I used the word pack instinct one time. Dogs have a pack instinct. They'll oftentimes follow the pack. Cats are not herd animals. If you put dogs in the wild, they'll find another dog and they'll start following the pack.